Good morning. We are in 2 Corinthians chapter 12 and 13 for our daily Take 5. So glad that you are here joining us. Let's dig in. We see here a couple things. We see here maybe one of Paul's maybe famous quotes, or one that we remember Paul by. He talks about this thorn in the flesh that he has. And we see almost a little bit of sarcasm in Paul as he's talking about boasting. And but also we see maybe some humility in Paul as he talks about the experiences that he has had, and really the one experience that he brings to light that maybe we're kind of wondering is, he talks about a man who has been called up to the third heaven. And this would be something that they equivalent to paradise, or being in the presence of angels or God himself. When they those that were listening to Paul, the church here is Paul doesn't say it right here, but we see later that Paul is speaking of himself when he says, I know a man who has been called, right, who has seen these visions and has spoken to God, and had this extraordinary, great experience and vision, this revelation that was given to him. And something that he was saying, like, he's kind of naming his credentials, like all these things, yet I could boast upon, but he's not. He's not going to boast. And we see this little bit of tension of Paul and the church not standing up for Paul. We see evidence that maybe there were some false accusations where people were considering Paul as a false prophet when we read this chapter. But Paul talks about his experiences, but then he couples this and he complements it with the thorn in his flesh. And I believe these are warnings and teachings for us as Christians, that we should understand not just the workings of Christ in our life, but also the weakness of our own flesh, to keep us humble and to keep us meek, and to help us not become big-headed or arrogant in our ways. But we see here in the life of Paul that he had some credentials, some great credentials to really boast in the things that God was doing in his life. But yet he chose to be sensitive and to understand that he was still weak and he is still in the flesh. But the greatness in his life is the works and the working of Christ, in the Spirit of God's hand upon him. And so he did not want to be foolish, and he did not want to be conceited or bloated, but yet he wanted to stay humble. And he credited the thorn in the flesh that he said that, that Satan put in his flesh, but yet that God perfected in him as a means to keep him humble and to keep him grateful for the work and the grace of Christ and what he is doing in his life. Some of these verses that really stand out. Verse 7, it says, because of the extraordinary greatness of the revelation, for this reason, to keep me from exalting myself, there was given to me a thorn in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me, to keep me from exalting myself. Concerning the thorn, I plead with the Lord. 3 times he wanted this thorn removed, that it might leave him. And verse 9, and he said to me, speaking of God's answer to Paul's prayer, speaking to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for power is perfected in weakness. Most gladly, therefore, I will rather boast about my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may dwell in me. Therefore, I delight in weaknesses, in insults, in distresses, in persecutions, in difficulties, in behalf of Christ. For when I am weak, then I am strong. Man, these are some rich verses here, and just rich truths for the life of a Christian, why we can have peace in the midst of suffering and of troubles, in the midst of illness and sicknesses, in the midst of heartache and death and in storms of this life, that in these weaknesses we are made strong. And in these times and in these trials, God is perfecting something way more beautiful. And His grace, guys, His grace, that truth right there, His grace is sufficient. Let that rest on you today. That God's grace, His love, is greater than any sin and weakness in our life. It is greater than any trial or any struggle or any storm or any doctor report or any test result or any heartache or breakup or whatever that may be. His grace is greater. And we can rest in that. As Paul did, he was going to boast in his weakness for God's grace to be exalted and to be manifested in greater ways, not just in his life, but those around him. And we too can say the same as Paul said, right? I will boast that much more in my weakness. Because when we are weak, Christ's strength and His grace and His love and His mercy shines brighter. Guys, I love you. Continue to keep digging into the Word of God. Continue to meditate on that. Dig and allow that to soak into your hearts and permeate, be displayed in your life. Love you. Have a blessed day.